Well, that was a false start. But anyway, good morning, everybody. Namaskar. Shubho Prabhatam. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I'd like to begin by thanking Mr. Rahul Jain very much for the invitation. Rahul and his colleagues, that is. And also to the Dibrugarh University. And for these arrangements, and I would say that this is a very extraordinary literary festival in many ways, because it is very much, apart from being in a university, which is unusual for literary festivals, it also has a large number of students attending each of the sessions, which makes it very invigorating and encouraging for anybody who is speaking. I think that we're just following up on the opening session in speaking, in continuing to discuss Africa. Now, Africa is a very great continent, and I think it's important to allow African voices to speak about Africa. So, by and large, I'm going to say very little and leave it to my colleagues on the dais to do the speaking. It is a very important session. The title itself is very omnibus. It's a hugely portmanteau subject. Time for Africa, perspectives, people, literature. So I'd request the speakers, if they can, to please not only speak about their personal experiences, but also about their countries and Pan-Africanism. I think that we have here, you've heard the short biographies of the speakers. We have here a representative from South Africa. We have a representative from Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Norway. And we have someone, eminent person from Cape Verde, also who lives considerable amount of time in Portugal. So I think the best thing to do now would be to start off, and I'd request Mr. Sifo Mahala to please take the floor and introduce the subject from his point of view. Thank you.
Okay. Greetings, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think from the onset, I must thank Dibrugarh University and Focal, the Foundation for Culture, Arts and Literature, for inviting us. And I think I'll be speaking on my behalf and also on behalf of my fellow South African in the audience, Shaman Khan, that it's a great honor that we've been invited here in a festival that focuses on Africa. In one of the most dominant languages in South Africa, isiZulu. When we greet, we say Sanibonani. Essentially, what it means literally is that we see you. And by focusing on Africa, we feel that you see us. That's why we really appreciated the fact that the program began with the documentary and a performance by African students. There is a tendency to think of Africa as a continent, as a very exotic place. So it was wonderful to see these students and to see us. Africa is a place where people live. And coming from South Africa, the country that has strong cultural connections with India. That South Africa is one of the most populous countries, or one of the countries with leading countries with a population of people of Indian descent. In fact, we have the Indian community in South Africa. They have been there for about 200 years. And that speaks to our history, and that also speaks to the cultural connections that we have. That some of the personalities, prominent personalities like your Mahatma Gandhi, actually lived in South Africa and was involved with some movements there. But we're talking about the Africa of today. In talking about the Africa of today, we cannot but reflect on where we're coming from. And perhaps one of the common areas or common factors in terms of the history of South Africa and the history of India is that both countries have suffered colonial dominance. And as we know, colonization takes different forms and entrenches itself even beyond the period where colonialism ends formally. That's one of the reasons that I'm standing here speaking English. But I'm also proud that we have done our best to retain our languages, among other things. It's been mentioned here that I write in English and my mother tongue is Xhosa. So in South Africa, we have 12 official languages, including English and sign language. There is what we call Afrikaans, which is a mix of different languages, predominantly Dutch, and that again points to our history. So I converse in at least 5 of those languages. And quite interestingly, some of the languages were part of the songs that we heard here today. And the opening song, in fact, evokes so many memories in as far as South Africa is concerned. It is a song performed by Shakira, who collaborated with a local band in South Africa called Freshly Ground. So much as the target was to find an international star. But the rhythm is that of South Africa because of the involvement of local music. In fact, South Africa hosting the World Cup in 2010 was more about saying Africa is capable, and this is not just about football. And we continue to prove this in different realms, including literature. In the recent past, we've had African writers and writers from South Africa, amongst others, who win awards internationally. And most of the time, they will be thought to be discovered. And in reality, they are seen as being discovered because Europe is discovering them, or the West is discovering them at that moment. But the reality is, we've been writing, we've been telling stories, we've been finding different platforms of telling our stories. That is why we really appreciate this opportunity that you're giving us a voice to speak. On a personal note, I lived 20 years of my life under apartheid, if you can do your math, you realize that I'm now 50 years old. There was transition in South Africa in 1994, which resulted in Nelson Mandela becoming the first democratically elected president. So what that means is that from that point, we were now, that is, when I say we, black people in South Africa were recognized as equal citizens as other races. So this shift became visible even in our literature. Because prior to 94, our literature largely was speaking against apartheid. Our writers and artists across the board were at the forefront of the struggle because literature connects people. Art connects people. In fact, we usually say literature among people is friendship among people. So it was through the arts, among other things, that South Africa was able to mobilize international solidarity against apartheid. You can date back, for instance, to 1963, when a South African musician called Miriam Makeba went to address the United Nations about apartheid. And 3 years later, apartheid was declared as a crime against humanity. So this is one of the examples that you can cite in terms of the role of cultural activists and intellectuals in fighting against apartheid, because the struggle for freedom in South Africa was not won on the battlefront. It was through the arts, it was through international mobilization that we were able to defeat apartheid. So now, post 1994, now that South Africa is a free country, what is cultural production? In other words, the question has always been that once the grand theme of apartheid has been removed, what will South African writers write about? Gwen Brooks, American writer who was at some point the National Poet Laureate of Illinois, once asked, what is there to write about except everything? So what you see in South African literature at the moment is that you have writers who are not confined by a particular theme. You have writers who explore different aspects of their lives. And the diversity of South African culture in particular, you find it in our literature. So while I cannot confine our thematic focus as writers, I can say South African writers are more at liberty now to write any topic. I'm saying they are at liberty because we come from a background where writers were persecuted for writing, writers were banned, and many ended up in exile, living in different countries because their voices were suppressed. So now you find writers who are at liberty to reflect on their society, commend what they believe is good, and critique the society, including those in power. So, relatively speaking, I would say South African writers and thinkers in general are capable of confronting any issues. And I'm speaking here as a former government official. In fact, when I first met Vigaswaru in Pretoria, where I live, he was the ambassador of India in South Africa, and I worked for the Ministry of Culture in South Africa. But I've since left government. I'm now in academia. But even though I'm in academia, or rather, even when I was still within government, I never felt confined. In other words, I continued writing for newspapers, writing books, but there was never a moment where a government official or a politician would ask to look at what I write before I publish. So even when I was in government, I was able to criticize some of the things that I believed were not going well. And there hasn't been any persecution in as far as that is concerned. This, by the way, is not to say we are a perfect society. In the main, I would say South Africa continues to respect the human rights. Our history of apartheid is part of the reason why South Africa challenges some of the human rights atrocities that are found in the world. So, to come to my writing as a person, I will be launching a short story collection called The Missing Pages. It's The Missing Pages because, actually, the title story reflects on an incident that happened over 200 years ago, or rather, over 100 years ago, in 1899, between 1899 and 1902, where two groups of Europeans were fighting over land in South Africa. This is what is called the Anglo-Boer War. It's called Anglo-Boer War because, on the one hand, there were the descendants of the English, and on the other, there were the descendants of the Dutch, who were fighting over land in South Africa. But history excluded the role of black people in that war and how they were affected by the war. Because the inhabitants of this land existed in the midst of that war. So this is a story that reimagines part of what happened, and we're able to write this because one South African writer, Saul Cheki Sopraki, in fact, wrote a war diary during that period, but there were certain missing pages in that war diary. So, this is what I believe is the role of a writer in contemporary society, to address some blank pages in our history. So we try to inform while at the same time entertaining. So history has no gray areas, and it is the duty of the writer to ensure that such stories are told. And lastly, I am the editor of Boneza Journal for African Writing. Boneza was founded with the aim of putting African writers together. So what this festival is trying to do now, bringing African writers, is in line with the objectives of Boneza, which tries to bring African voices, and largely publishing both in English and the various African languages. So what we try to do is to bring in writers from across the continent and the diaspora so that they can tell their stories the way they understand them, in the way they feel like telling them. So in short, this platform, I see it as an opportunity for African writers to get their voices heard, and that is exactly what I stand for and the work that I do. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Professor Mahala. Thank you. A very cogent explanation. South Africa was one of the last countries in Africa to achieve complete freedom and has very quickly moved to the top of the international community in expressing the wishes and desires of what is now called the Global South. Now I'd like to turn to Mr. Raïs Boneza. He has already been introduced from the rostrum, but I'd like to say that he's also the unofficial mayor of Trondheim, which has not been stated. Thank you, Raïs.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and lovers of stories that matters. Namaskar. It is a very important gathering today, here at the Dibrugarh University International Literature Festival. Very important. I've got even that vision, that this is probably the route to implement probably a residency for writers in the future at the university here, bringing all the writers, especially from Africa, as today is the time from Africa, as we say. What's an adventure that could be? Because you said it started 1 year ago, now we have, that is the second, that is an adventure. And I say thank you again for gathering us here. Today we gather not only to discuss Africa, but also to unshake it from myths, from margins, and from the suffocating grip of the world that has too long silenced its symphony of voices. Imagine this, a continent pulsating with 54 nations, 2,000 languages, but not only, I'm talking about languages, but I'm not talking about dialects, because in Africa, language and dialect are two kind of different things. If we say dialects, then probably it should be, I don't know. So in Congo we have like 200 languages, and dialects are more than 500. So you see how beautiful the culture and the literature can be, the stories can be. And those languages and dialects are that old, very old, that all the empires that have existed until now. Yet, for centuries, the world has flattened this tapestry into a single trait: poverty, chaos, only that, or safaris for others. So everything is more on that way. But I ask you, when will Africa cease to be a footnote of its own history? When will it be? The answer is now. It's always now, and now, not tomorrow, but now, and now, and now. Let's speak plainly. African literature has danced for too long in the cloakhold of two masters: ghettoization and globalization. Ghettoization, why? You know, it considered different than other literature. An African writer is probably more considered different than other. There is a kind of apartheid in the world when it comes to African literature. The conquests, colonization, and the cold calculus of modern empires have tried to dictate its rhythm. But as Gungi Wachongo warned, globalization today is but colonialism in a sleek new fit. Its institution acting as a puppet masters for African creative soul. Yes, here is the truth they fear. Africa is the storytellers. No, they fear Africa's storytellers. Because we find them everywhere, they exist everywhere, in every corner. Because, you know, most of the time people do speak on and about Africa without Africans. And everyone will speak on Africa or about Africa without African is speaking against Africa. But these storytellers, let's say from the oratory of Mali to the searing prose of Wole Soyinka, this is a continent that breathes narrative. But when Chimamanda Adichie speaks of the danger of a single story, she strikes at the heart of a global crime, the erasure of Africa's complexity. Joseph Conrad, Hearts of Darkness, cast a long shadow. But African writers are the light. We are here, and we can show, you can see that light. Okay, picture a writer in Lagos, Nairobi, or Dakar, pen in the hand. No, I'm not saying pen in the hand. Let's say computer in hand. We have also computers in Africa, yes? Staring down a dilemma. So the dilemma of that writer is about, should I write for my people? Or should I write or twist my truth to fit Western shells? So most of the publishers demand poverty porn, conflict tropes, or safari-ready cliché. But African literature is not a zoo for foreign gaze. China said, they once said, until the lion have their own historian, the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. Yes. Today the lions are roaring. We are here. Yet even as diaspora voice, Adichie, Daneisi, Kot, Yagasi, Carla Fernandes there, Bridge Continent, they grapple with exile, or to keep roots alive in alien soil. Let's be bold. Book are act of defiance. In a world where a novel can cost a month wage in Kinshasa, for example, writing become a rebellion. But African writers are alchemists, turning struggle into art. They are custodian of ancestral wisdom. Not only ancestral wisdom, but also their own story of today. They are critic of corrupt power and architect of future, yet unwritten. Consider this. When Aimé Césaire wrote his discourse on colonialism, he didn't just write a book. He launched a missile at empire. When Warsaw Shire declared, "No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark," she doesn't just describe migration, she humanizes it. This is literature that doesn't whisper, it thunders. To those who reduce Africa to safaris and sorrow, we say, look closer. This is a continent where every village has a poet. Every market has a philosopher. Its literature is not a museum of relic, but a living, like the philosophy in Africa, is a philosophy, a living philosophy. When we say Ubuntu, for example, one is one example. I am because you are. My pain is your pain. So we live in the present. So it's not a relic of but a living and breathing force. A mirror held up to the world, hypocrisy and hope. And this festival, we stand at a crossroad. We will not let globalization homogenize Africa's voice. No, we will not. Or we will build platform where its story soar and tend inapologetic. Like the African writers today, they are inapologetic. There is nothing about nostalgia, village, whatever. See the new generation writing, so they write inapologetically. So let this be our path. We will read not to pity, but to learn. We will publish not to profit, but to amplify. We will celebrate not just the Chimandas and Ngugis, but the unsung scribes in Accra's, Harley's, in Johannesburg Township, in the mountain of the Virunga, in eastern Congo, in the African Great Lakes, in the Sudan, in Kigali, Goma, Nairobi, all over Africa. Because the writers in Africa, they teach us resilience, they demand justice, they dare us to imagine a world where literature is not a luxury, but a lifeline. As we stand in the shadow of Rangar Auditorium, which actually are present, I thought Rangar was some famous person, but they told me actually it's mean house, something like that, yeah? Shelter, is it a house? Something like that? Yeah. Yeah. As we stand in the shadow of Rangar Auditorium, a monument to history, let us make new history. Let this festival and festivity be the spark that imagine a revolution of the world. The single story hand here. The time for Africa is not tomorrow, is it? It is now. Let the world lean in, let the page turn, let Africa speak, and make the future listen. Asante sana.
Thank you very much indeed. It's wonderful to have you with us. Now I turn to Joaquim Arena. As you probably heard, his latest book, Syriac and Mr. Charles, perhaps, has won the most prestigious award of the Portuguese, let us say, intellectuals. And I request him now kindly to speak to us. Senor Arena. You could...
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank, first of all, the focal members and the University of Dibrugarh for having me here after 5 flights across the planet, and to be here in this wonderful ceremony with this wonderful audience dedicated to something that is becoming rare, which is literature. In our world, we've become a kind of a tribe because other things are more important or becoming more important in the world, in our societies, than literature. So we're becoming some kind of a rare persons that get together to discuss these strange things that come, and words and stories that come in books. And the new generation is, they're getting farther and farther from this world of literature, of stories, of books. And I was amazed when I saw that video from the beginning of this ceremony that showed Africa. And as we all know, India comes from Africa. Before mankind, there was the continent. And India, it was part of Africa. And then India separated from Africa millions of years ago, of course, to join Asia. That's why we can find shells and fish bones in the Himalayas today. So we're not so far from Africa. Before mankind, India was already in Africa. And I myself, I come from a very tiny country of 500,000 people in West Africa, an archipelago of 10 islands off the coast of Senegal. So I'm in the most populated country in the world, coming from a 500 people country. So this is very interesting for me. And as I was coming to Dibrugarh, I stayed for a while in Mumbai. It was amazing for me to see how all these people on the streets of the city. And for those who come from bigger countries, much more population, it's quite different, but for me, it's amazing and it is very, very interesting. It's extraordinary. Well, we're here to talk about African literature, but Africa is not a country, as we know, as we say. So there's no such thing as African literature, because we have literatures in Africa, because Africa is quite different from north to south, as you know, different people, different ways of thinking, different colonization, and it's a different world, not like the European literature. We can say, and we always say, and we teach European literature, because it's quite different. And from the last 3 centuries, let's say, we can talk about literature the way we do today, since Shakespeare, Miguel de Cervantes, and in the 19th century, when it came as we know it, literature. But Europe in the 19th century had the Industrial Revolution, which means the society, the middle class or the upper middle class was established. And so the market, because literature needs a market, needs publishers, writers, and all a system of selling books. We don't have this in Africa because we come from a different tradition. We come from oral stories. Our literature is oral literature. So we don't follow. We do not have to follow the same path as the Europeans. And I think we should avoid to make this always to compare because it's not the same way. We don't have the same tradition. We don't have the same story. So I come from Cape Verde. Cape Verde was not populated when the Portuguese first arrived there in the 15th century. And we were populated by enslaved men and women brought from West Africa. So Cape Verde was the first country of the African diaspora. I represent the African diaspora because I have Portuguese blood and African blood. We are kind of a Caribbean that never was, because we're not Africans in the sense of the continent. We don't have savannas, we don't have wild animals, we have a different culture, but at the same time we're Africans because we are regional Africa, like the Seychelles, like Mauritius. They're part of Africa as well, but a different Africa. And my work, my literature is to write about the African diaspora, because that's where I come from. And for centuries there were Africans in Europe. The first were brought by the Portuguese and the Spanish and the English, and some of them, they became very important people, professors in the universities, and philosophers, and generals. Napoleon had an African general, and in the Tsar of Russia, Peter the Great, he was offered a boy from Cameroon. And it's interesting that the boy was bought by Turks and sent with a bunch of slaves to Constantinople. And at the time, the ambassador of the Tsar in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire, was the great-grandfather of Lev Tolstoy, the great writer. He bought this boy and his brother, named Abdul, and he sent these two boys to the Tsar, Peter the Great. And Peter became fond of one of them, and he named him Gannibal. And Gannibal was educated in Moscow and in Paris. He studied in a military school, so he became a general. So in the imperial army of the Tsar, there was this general, a black general. And it happens that this black general is the great-grandfather of the founding father of Russian literature, which is Alexander Pushkin. Alexander Pushkin is the great-grandson of a black slave who became a general of the Tsar. And in France, this Napoleon general, who entered with him in Cairo when they invaded Egypt 200 years ago, was a black general who came from Saint Domingue in the Caribbean, who happens to be the father of Alexander Dumas. So you can see two black men taken from Africa or taken from the Caribbean and brought to Europe, who became grandfather and great-grandfather of great names of letters, European letters. So I found this amazing. And when I started my journalism and my writings, I decided I should write, whether it was essays or fiction. This is my subject, and my subject is to give life to these people and to tell this story, because we Africans, we've been in, like you Indians, we've been in Europe long ago, long before the 20th century, and before the humanization of the black man that comes from the 19th century with the racism, the so-called scientific racism, which was a way to justify the colonialism, which is, because they needed a justification to to respond for the acts in Africa, which is the same to say the white man's burden to bring civilization to Africa. So in order to do that, they had to picture black man without soul. Black man was to be humanized in order to help this theory of white man, white civilization coming to Africa to bring civilization, whereas we had civilization in Africa, we had empires long before the Europeans got there. So my subject, when I decided to write, was to bring all these stories, whether they're in America or in Europe, and to show that we Africans, we've been there a long time ago, and we are doing things that can show our culture and can bring our stories. And Cape Verde, as the first place, the first gateway from Africa, represents a different dimension of Africa. And we represent people who were taken from the mainland and brought to the islands, and were, as they arrived, their names were replaced by Antonio, Manuel, Francisco, and we lost our roots. And this is very sad, because if you go to Central America or South America, if you go to Bahia in Brazil, you will find African culture. They have this candomblé, this syncretic religion. Or if you go to Haiti, you have voodoo, or Santeria in Cuba. But we Cape Verdeans, we have nothing. We lost everything. And this was a very terrible process of memory. And once you lose your memory, your roots, you become a different person. You have to reborn. So we are people who had to reborn again, and to found a new society, a mixed race society. So memory, literature is memory and imagination, but it depends on the writers. For myself as a writer, I cannot think of literature without memory and our experience or experience of people around us, stories around us. So in order to bring some memories, some stories, I choose to write about the African diaspora, especially to show that we have done such great things in the past, long before the Europeans went to Africa. And maybe like you Indian people, you have a diaspora. We all know Indians are everywhere, and Africans are everywhere, and Cape Verdeans are in many places, because we are just 500,000 people, but we have more Cape Verdeans outside the islands than in our country. We have in the United States and in Europe. And this diaspora means stories, means lives, and means confronting cultures, your own culture with the new culture, the children, and how to pass our values, our culture, and how can we live in this balance between different cultures. We see this in Europe. We see we have a very important European population from African descent in Britain, in Portugal, and France. So we are writing a different story which is the black Europeans. We always think of Afro-Americans. We have Afro-Europeans. We never speak of Afro-Europeans. We have generations. People coming from Angola, Mozambique, or Togo, and the Caribbeans, their children in Europe, they are Europeans. We are part of the big diaspora. And there are some writers like me in these countries, in France, in Britain, in Netherlands, who are writing these stories. Like in Britain, the sons and the descendants of Indians, as we know, Hanif Qureshi and other writers who are doing this. And it's a new literature, a new kind of literature, a new way to address our culture. So this is my subject, and like I said, this is interesting being here with you and being able to talk about my country, talk about my subject, my literature, which is something I usually do in Europe and South America, and it is the first time I'm here in India, and with great pleasure to address to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Señor Arena. A very interesting history of the diaspora and also the historical context of that and its connection with literature. Thank you so much. If I may be so bold, I'd like to say a word or two, and I might retrace some of your footsteps. There is evidence in sculpture and archaeology of the African footprint in India long before the presence of the European. And you'll be interested to know that that footprint clearly shows that there were Africans who fought in India and achieved a status which you might call general, which was they led armies in India into battle. Of course, India and Africa at one time were joined together. It was a united landmass, and certainly the first African migration, if you could call it that, was to India. So our connections are extremely historic. I'd like to just say that a word about India and Africa today. The relationship that India has with Africa is very close. I think we are the third largest country for African exports, and we are the fifth largest investor in Africa. And yet, I would say, and I don't think that this will be challenged, that the relationship between India and Africa is both understudied and undervalued. The first question I pose to myself is, should Africa be treated as a cohort entity? You've touched on that yourself. It is a continent with 54 members, or 55, depending on whether you consider Tigray an independent country or not. And isn't it rather presumptuous for India to compare itself with the continent of Africa? I think that the populations, yes, they're roughly similar, but on the other hand, in Africa, though African countries are grouped into a union, the union is far from being a union like the European Union. It is different in terms of attire, religion, customs, race, language, and economic development. And an obvious four-way split would be Arabic-speaking Africa, English-speaking Africa, French-speaking Africa and Lusophone-speaking Africa. And Africa has no less than 8 regional economic communities, possibly more, because there is scope for a great deal more cooperation. Touching on the Indian community in Africa, which is present in nearly every country, the Indian community is not uniform in history or in closeness to India itself, and or in the occupations that they presently follow. The community, of course, was brought to Africa by the British Empire, which moved huge masses of people, millions of people, across the globe, from India to the Pacific and to the Atlantic. And these people in the 19th and 20th century went to foreign countries to work. They worked in the railways and they worked in the fields. And in the Atlantic, of course, they were responsible for sugarcane cultivation. They also participated as an extension of their activity in trade. That came slightly later than the manual labor. So they were petty shopkeepers. And as petty shopkeepers, they also indulged in giving loans and providing credit, which did not make them enormously popular in Africa. We have to face that unpleasant fact. Many people who I know personally, who are descendants of those same, what we call indentured laborers, speak of a very deep sociological problem which they faced. A problem where they were eliminated from society because they were the white colonial settlers who grabbed the greater amount of land and also position, and the African community who were deprived from the beginning. So they were caught, in a way, in no man's land. After the countries in Africa became independent, more or less from 1960 onwards, there were exceptions, of course. Ethiopia was never a colony, and Ghana was independent in the 50s. But mainly after 1960, a large number of countries became independent, and another wave of Indians followed in professional fields, in schools, in universities, and in engineering and other such activities, medical activities, nurses, doctors, and so on. And the profile, therefore, of the Indian community considerably. We are quite right in concentrating on the convergences of Africa rather than the differences. And I think that these convergences have been very well brought out by the speakers today. And I think that we have to recognize that in all these factors, Africa has led the way in one tremendous example to the rest of the world, that it was decided in 1964 that the borders of African countries, as determined at the time of independence, would remain constant. Now, this has been followed pretty accurately up to now, with, again, the possible exceptions of Tigray and the ongoing problems between Congo and Rwanda, which seem to be based on perhaps an inaccurate sense of where the border lies and where the communities from Africa, from Rwanda particularly, have encroached into Democratic Republic of Congo. I'd say that we should consider that dealing with Africa is a matter of great sensitivity. And I think it's time we recognize that Africa is entitled to a seat on the UN Security Council, and perhaps more than one seat on the UN Security Council. And we must hope that when the expansion of the Council takes place, Africa is properly represented. After all, Africa in 2050 is going to have 2.5 billion people. That is the expectation, and at that time it will have 25% of the world's population. Africa is already 9th out of 20 countries, according to the IMF, as the fastest growing economies in the world. And Africa has 60% of the world in uncultivated arable land. This makes Africa, among its mineral and other resources, enormously, it has enormous potential for tremendous growth in future. Dear speakers, you may think that cricket is the only passion for Indian sports lovers. But you may be surprised to know that football, soccer, is extremely popular in this part of India, which is the northeast, and also in the southeast part of India. And you may be further surprised to know that the great celebrity players in India are from Africa. They're probably not good enough to find a place in the African national teams, but they certainly find a place in the Indian football leagues, and they're very close to our hearts indeed. I'd just like to say a word about literature. I'm really sorry to say that we are much more familiar with what one might call the older generation of writers from Africa than the contemporary writers. We can discuss why that should be so, but I'm thinking of Wole Soyinka, who was mentioned in the video that we saw, Chinua Achebe, of course, Ai Abrar from Ghana, and the writers from South Africa, Nadine Gordimer, after all, Nobel Prize winner, and Alan Paton, and Coetzee. So we're very familiar with some, but the modern generation of Africans probably don't consider these to be the writers of choice of today. But I think you touched on that also, Joaquim. I mean, why is it so? And I think that we may have to leave that for further discussion, but it's obviously a fault of publishers. It's a fault of the translations not coming to India. And the fact is that the present Indian population is really blissfully ignorant of the popularity of present writers from Africa. And therefore, I think we owe special thanks to Rahul Jain and to the Dibrugarh University for bringing us face to face with contemporary African literature. Would you like to say just a couple of sentences just to wind up?
Thank you. Well, I'll try to touch on a couple of things. I can't cover everything you've said. One of the things we've said, for instance, is that India should not compare itself with Africa. And I agree. I think we have to think more about collaboration as opposed to comparing. And this collaboration really can be facilitated best through cultural exchange. And the fact that I'm here today, there's an opportunity that I would buy and read works by Indian writers, and vice versa. I would expect that Indian audiences will pick up a book by any of the visiting writers. Because what literature does really is to transport you to that culture, to that country. I know something about India because I've read works that talk about India. So that is the importance of literature. I think let us look at collaborations. And one of the areas, for instance, you talk about lack of knowledge of contemporary writers. And that is true, and there are practical ways of addressing that. And one of those would be to consider, again, collaboration what we call sometimes twinning. There's a festival in Nigeria called Ake Festival, organized by Alola Shoneyin, who would have been here, unfortunately, who couldn't be here. That just like here, every year they host over 100 writers from across the African continent. All right. So if you look at the program, you'd see who are the African voices, prominent African voices out there. As I said earlier, I do run a journal, a literary journal, where I publish works by African writers. So you'd again see there, for instance, yes, in Abeokuta. Yes. Ake Festival takes place in Abeokuta, a place in Nigeria. And actually, Shoyinga is one of the patrons, but they are much younger writers. Probably the most well-known writer at the moment in this generation is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, whom Raïs mentioned earlier. There are many more, and not just from Nigeria, from across the continent. And one of the issues you raised, for instance, is whether the African Union is not like the European Union. That is true, and it should be so. Because the circumstances, the conditions in these continents are different. So we cannot model ourselves on the AU. And what does the AU aspire, or what does Africa need? I think before we worry about these formal structures, there are practical ways in which Africa can sustain itself. And one of those ways is to encourage free trade so that there are visa-free countries across the African continent. It doesn't make sense that when I travel to a European country, which happens to be part of the Commonwealth, then I would travel without a visa. And yet, I have to spend so much time and energy trying to get a visa to travel to Nigeria. So, those are issues that I believe should be looked at. There are regional organizations like SADC in Southern Africa, like ECOWAS in East Africa. And I think we can strengthen those, and again, to ensure exchange, not just economically, but culturally, exchange of books, exchange of knowledge. And, everything else can follow from the position of having a cultural understanding, a cultural connection between different countries on the African continent. Thanks.
Hello? No? No, it's me. Yeah. For, let's say, comparing India to Africa, I don't think in this world we need to compare each other. Everyone should be unique in their uniqueness, and we should put more emphasis in cooperation and solidarity than trying to each other, compare each other. Because we are beautiful as we are, and we need to have our indigenous development. Africa needs to develop itself with considering its roots and its reality, as India should do, as other countries in Asia should do. And no one should impose each other whatever they want, what they think it's better for them. For example, I was in the field, when it comes to literature and culture, there is something we love to call democracy in the world. So something we need to, sometimes some countries like to export. So when they export it, and then you find some countries become totally dysfunctional. So there were, one time I was in, not one time, it was in 2008, I was DRC, the Congo, observing the elections. What happened? I went into the up countries and I was talking to people about the votes and democracy. And no one understood actually. I find people asking me, but who is that democracy person you are talking about? I need to meet him to talk to that person because I don't understand who is that democracy. And then when we're talking about constitution, another old lady is coming to me, you know, I've heard about constitution, but who is that person? So the thing is that we need to convey what's the values in those words, because there is no, for example, a translation of democracy in any African language, proper translation. Because if you do it in Swahili, it will be democracia, but what does it mean? So the thing is that when you bring it to the people, you do not bring the word democracy, they will not understand, but bring the values, freedom. When you explain freedom, voting, and others, oh, but why did you didn't say that? Because we didn't know what, you know. So that is another aspect, especially when I work with the translation of what I write and literature. So sometimes, you know, when you're writing these imperialistic languages that you have inherited, and you have to translate it again, so we work with imagery and stuff like that. So that is another discussion. But when it comes to the African Union, the African Union, as imperfect it is, but it's a good project. And I salute, actually, because it's a dream. We had a dysfunctional OAU before. At least the African Union still the project, and it's still ongoing. So we need to go, I think, to support it at some way and see the way it goes. Because it is more aspirational than the European Union. Because in the African Union we have what we call the Commission of Peace, the Peace Commission. In the European Union we don't have the Peace Commission. So we talk about security and defense. So you think already war. So at least we think about peace. So it's something. And we have regional bloc. We should encourage regional bloc like the Sahel region, what is happening. So young people are taking initiatives, whatever you call it, coup d'etats or whatever, but people are supporting those young people there. And they are doing some change in that sphere. So the last thing about the borders, that's an example. For example, in the current conflict between Rwanda, you talked about the borders. It's never been about the borders. It's more complicated than that, because actually borders are just there. People in the Congo have 9 frontiers with different countries. Most of the people that live on the frontier, you find them on both sides, and the same language. Actually, for example, let's say we have a frontier with Angola, but we have an old kingdom, empire actually, the Lunda Empire, which still exists, who still have an emperor who reigned there, but is still the chief of all the Lundas from the other border and this border too. So on the other side of Rwanda, when you go to this town called Goma, which was taken by the rebel, you don't even know if there is a frontier border, because there is houses that are built on the border. So during the day, you are watching TV in your living room. At night, you are going to sleep. Your room is on the other side of the border, so you are sleeping in Rwanda. So the thing is that it's not all the time about the border, because before that, we didn't have that conflict about border. It's only when it has a lot of layers, and then that can take hours to go into that. So I think, yes.
Well, this very interesting questions. Well, I can say that one thing that bothers me, but there is nothing I can do about it, is the fact that we, African writers, we still need an echo from Europe or from the States in order to be recognized as writers. For instance, Portuguese-speaking writers in Africa, if they want to have a writing career, they have to be published in Portugal, in Lisbon. I think it happens the same with French and English speaking writers in Africa, because our ties with our former colonial power, it's very strong, and in certain ways, I mean, considering literature, this is the case. I come from Cape Verde. I was published, all my books were published in Portugal. And so I have a literature career, let's put it this way. I go to Brazil, which is the biggest Portuguese-speaking country in the world. I go every year, many times a year. I get recognized there. My books are published there. I have an audience there, in Portugal as well. And I go to Spain, Italy, France. But for those who are still writing and their books are published in Africa, in Luanda, in Maputo, in all other capitals of these ancient Portuguese colonies, they don't get this chance, the opportunity to get into the business because they're not published in Europe. And what is happening now, he was telling about Chimamanda Adichie. She became fashion. Well, she's a good writer, but we have many good writers. But still, there is a fashion thing about discovering African writers from Nigeria, Ghana, from the English-speaking countries, by publishers in the United States. It's a business. We all know it's a business. And we still depend on this market because we don't have a market in Africa. Our societies have different priorities, which is to feed the Africans, to feed the people. Before the book, people may think of buying food, or a family buy food for the children instead of buying books. We have different priorities. So, and this means a different rhythm, different market, and a different approach to literature. We have some writers in the way of European writers, American writers. But as I said before, it's not in our tradition. And as long as we live this way without a market, well, we can say other commodities. We don't have markets like in the West. So we depend always, we're depending on what, and this is the part of it that I don't like, because we depend on the criticism of, in Europe, the publishers, and somehow, some of them, they look at us with, the ancient colonies. So when I got this prize, this literature, which is the biggest for a Portuguese book, a novel, my editor, my publisher, he told me, Joaquim, you can't imagine the phone calls I get asking, who is this Joaquim? Because I dared to write a book, and it was chosen. And it wasn't so good for most of them, because they look at us as their backyard. So Cape Verde is like a backyard of Portugal. And when a Cape Verdean writer rises and in the newspaper has a couple of pages about his book, it is something that annoys the reviews and the prizes, and even one journalist, he said, I don't know what's happening with us, because now all the literature prizes go to Brazil or to Africa. What's happening to our literature? So it's their fault. It's not that we like Salman Rushdie said once, the empire writes back. Now we are writing back, we, the ancient colonizers, but the publishers and the journalists and the Portuguese writers, they feel not comfortable. They're not. It's not good, and it's a very a complex thing for them to accept that in Africa, in Lusophone Africa, we are writing, and we are writing good. So it's something that we have to deal with.
Thank you very much, all three authors. Thank you so much. I've been asked to request the audience if you have any questions to ask them now. I think there must be somebody with a mic who can pass things around. There's a gentleman in the fourth, fifth row. Please be kind enough to indicate who you want to answer the question. Thank you.
Mr. Arena, you said you depend upon for business purpose. You write and so many things to people that from Africa, they need food and other things. So writing a book is what is your main thing? Writing a book is a business, or is there something special? Some social work. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Well, we write because we are writers and we have to tell stories. But in order to achieve our goal, we need somebody to read, like all work of art, like a painter. If I write and I keep my writing, it's not art. It's not considered, because I need the other side of the river. So, and to reach to the other side, I need somebody to take my book and to publish it and to take it to the audience, to the public. So I depend on it. It's like a painter, like Picasso, like any other painter or a musician. We need the other side of the river, and we need, in order to become artists. So in between there is this market thing, and we must face it. I know that there are some writers who write and don't care and don't even give interviews, and well, it's a choice. But I prefer to write, and I try to live on my writing. I write books and I write articles for newspapers, and I'm a man of letters. I mean, I make my life writing, so I need to sell. That's the way it is. But the art is always there. We're not becoming a different person, but we need to put the food on our table for our children. That's it.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I want us to complete a little bit what he's saying about the publishing and this. He's saying it very politely, actually, without going directly to the culprit. I think the problematic about why many of the writers, especially the young ones in Africa, are not now is the way the publication structure has been set up for a long time ago. It's a very, actually, as I said, we are in a dilemma. Is what I call the ghettoization of African literature. Even in the libraries, the way they place us, yeah, the way they identify us. Why can't we just be, I write novels, of course, I'm a writer, I'm a novelist. Why should I have that big, huge, cachet, me, African writer there? I'm just a writer first, before becoming that African writer. So it's the structure already. And the complexity of your question, do you write for the market or for the art and love of it? Of course, when you start writing, I will give the small story about when I started writing. When I started writing quite young, 9 years old or something like that. But I was writing love letters for adults. So they came to me, describe the lady, and I will write the love letter. So after some time, it was quite pleasing that I had to charge them. So they have to pay me a cinema ticket. So you describe the lady, I write, and then you give me the cinema ticket, so it's a win-win. At some point, from our work, we have to actually live for it, but the heart should be there. The passion should be there. But we should not stop because we have that. So, yeah, but the things that we have just to cast the structure, the chain. And by the way, I have a publisher, an Indian publisher, and it is good. So I don't complain too much. And who's giving those prices? So you see, it's still very colonialist. So who's giving the prices? If you don't get those prices, so you are not known. So the thing is that why? Yeah. Why we need to have more prices in India, more prices in China, more prices in Africa too. And I take account to those prices too. There are prices too when you have prices in China or in India or in Africa, not only in Europe.
Thank you. Does the gentleman there still want to ask a question? Please make it quick. Thank you. I think behind you.
Hello, I'm A.J. Thomas. I just want to, I'm not going to ask a question, I just want to add a little to Mr. Arena's connections that he made with the African continent, writers in the African continent and Europe. I want to go to the earlier era. St. Augustine of Hippo, he is from Africa. He is one of the earliest fathers of the Christian church. He is from near Tunisia, the ancient Carthage. And the general or the emperor, the Roman emperor, Septimus Severus, he was from Leptis Magna, and he himself built the city, So these two additions I just wanted to make.
I think any of the students want to ask anything? This is really for them. Sorry, just wait one moment, please.
Very welcome to everyone. So my question is for Professor Sifiu Mahala. So as both of our countries, India and Africa, were ruled, or rather should I say, exploited and looted, our ancestors went through immense hardship to revive our language and culture post-independence. So my question is, how did African writers use literature as a tool for reclaiming cultural identity and historical narratives after colonial rule?
Would you like to come in quickly and ask the question, that we can do them together? No?
Okay, thank you for that question. First of all, the irony is that African languages thrived despite European colonialism, specifically in South Africa. I don't know in other places. The reason for that is Europe was able to convert some Africans who were seen as being progressive. And the purpose for that, teaching them in Europe and all of that through missionary schools, studying missionary schools in South Africa. And they had a great influence in that. The purpose was to take a few elites and use them as a buffer, separating, I would say, the converted and those who were seen as backward. However, many African intellectuals, instead of being a buffer, they used European education to develop their societies. So they continued writing in African languages. And this is part of the reason why I struggle to understand when we speak of African literature, or when you look at Chinua Achebe, for instance, as the father of African literature. Many writers have been writing way before Achebe published Things Fall Apart in 1958. If you come to South Africa, for instance, particularly those who are writing in isiXhosa, my mother tongue is isiXhosa, and it was the first written language in Southern Africa, at least, because it's been around for over 200 years. The first isiXhosa text was written in 1823, meaning this year will mark 202 years of the language as a written language. So it began with the elite who were meant to be converted, but they were deeply rooted, they remained committed. They received European education, they welcomed it. Right. But they came back to Africa. Most of the time they went to study in Europe, but they came back and developed Africa. And the recourse for the missionaries and the colonialists was to say, these Africans should not go to Europe, because when they come back with ideas. One of the, for instance, the African National Congress, which is the ruling party now in collaboration with others, because they didn't get the majority. The African National Congress was founded in 1912. And the idea came with a person called Bixley Kaseme. He studied in the US, and in 1906, he delivered a speech called Regeneration of Africa, which was essentially about the sovereignty of Africa, encouraging Africans to stand on their own and sort of try and be independent of the colonizers. So he came back, and his influence resulted in the formation of the African National Congress as a liberation movement. So they realized that the Africans who leave the country and go to Europe come back with different ideas, because they can see that in some places the discrimination that you find in Africa is not exactly there, or at least is not to the same extent. So they started establishing institutions in Africa. Now, an institution in South Africa, for instance, like the University of Fort Hare, which was founded in 1916, again had the same effect, because Africans who came to study there, like your Robert Mugabe, for instance, like your Nelson Mandela, like your O.R. Tambo, they all studied in that institution. But again, education did not move them away from their people. Instead, they became more determined to fight for the rights of Africans. Thank you.
I think you would like me, I'm sure, to thank the various speakers today, and they were all extremely interesting, and I wish we could have continued, but I suppose hunger pangs must be descending on all of you now. So allow me just to thank you and to wish you a very happy rest of the Literary Festival. Thank you.